just to sort of provide context for this pre-rulemaking effort. So we have authority, and Hannah's going to talk more specifically about this in a moment, but we have authority in the statute to do rulemaking. And this pre-rulemaking process is an unofficial sort of front end to that process, where we get a group of folks like you together, excuse me, and are able to talk freely about the issues before we head into the formal rulemaking process. Once we get into formal rulemaking, which is defined in another section of statute, again, Hannah will talk more about this, but it's a very structured and I would say sort of stilted process. It's very formal and very sort of rigid and doesn't lend itself well to good discussions. So we typically, before we go into rulemaking, we don't want to just run into rulemaking with a rule that is doomed upon introduction. We want to spend some time in the front end, and we've done this with a number of our rules, trying to get a group like this together that represents all sides of the issue. People in this room and on the screen don't agree right now on this issue, but we're looking for middle ground. We're looking to have conversations with all of you and try to find middle ground. We're never going to reach exact consensus. We realize that, and that's the nature of these pre-rulemaking groups, is that we want to bring in perspectives from all sides of the issue, talk freely about what we would like to do in rulemaking, what our goals are there, and construct as best as possible the rule that's most likely to succeed in rulemaking. Typically, nobody is 100% satisfied with what we move into, but people understand on all sides of the issue, representing their different sectors, understand why we constructed the rule in the way that we did, and most of all, feel like their voice was heard, feel like their top issues were addressed in the way that we do construct that rule. It will be a draft rule until we actually kick off the formal rulemaking process. Then there'll be another bite at the apple. But again, in the formal rulemaking process, there'll be a public hearing, there'll be public comments filed, the availability to file public comments, and then we'll have to respond to those comments. And, more on that to come. But to start with, really, the rule is going to provide sort of the staircase, the linkage between the language and statute, which is very broad and generic, and then the specific permits that we have to issue. We get a permit application for Lake X. What are we going to do with that? And there's a large gap between what statute says and how we behave in a specific permit, and that's the role that a rule really fills. It helps to provide that transition from statutory, very broad, generic statutory language to how we behave in the permitting process. And a lot of what we're going to seek to do with this rule is to provide better definitions of things. The definitions of the terms that we have to look at when we make a decision about a permit, where we locate the bar in terms of, does this meet the justification necessary for a broad lake chemical treatment? Those sorts of issues are the issues, and Oliver and Misha are going to talk more about, and as part of the agenda setting, these specific issues. But we're going to talk about those things in this group. And again, hope to benefit from all of your input on all sides of the issue. We don't need consensus. We're not going to seek consensus because we'd probably be here forever. But instead, we're using this group as an advisory group to bring your particular focus, your particular expertise to the table that we can all consider. And in that regard, recognizing ahead of time that not everybody's going to agree, but being respectful of one another's positions. Somebody might say something that you disagree with completely, and try to explain, try to understand better why they're saying that, and then represent your position. As Oliver said, we're going to take notes. We'll continue to adjust and adapt along the way, and hopefully at the end of this process, wind up with a rule that's workable for everyone. That's our goal. And again, thanks. It's you'll make this rule better through your participation.
I like to
go ahead. No.
Yeah, just is this rulemaking specifically for herbicides, or is this if somebody has an issue with a lake and I want to put lake mats in, I want to do dredging, I want to do harvesting or whatever dash, is it all of that or just focused on herbicides?
I think we're primarily focusing on the herbicides.
Okay.
Yeah, on the chemical treatments. And it's not only weeds, it's pests as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think the where we see where the statutory permitting conditions have what I think is some room for improvement. I wouldn't necessarily say ambiguity, but room for improvement. And where we have the greatest, I think, public interest in our permitting is on herbicide, which is, under statute referred to as chemical treatments.
Okay.
So that's the principal focus of this group. I think if folks have comments about mechanical harvesting, diverse suction harvesting, bottom barriers, we can deal with those offline. But I think the goal of the rule is, as Pete said, to have a rule focused on how we do herbicide permitting or using chemicals to treat aquatic nuisances.
And when you said pests, can you just provide examples?
Seed lamprey
Seed lamprey.
control falls under aquatic nuisance control permitting. So any pesticide, it's not just herbicides, it's pesticides applied to state waters need an aquatic nuisance control permit, and seed lamprey is one of those examples.
We don't get a lot of permit applications, if any, for other pests, if you will, for other, fauna.
Okay.
We're in an environment where we get applications for sea lamprey and plants. Historically, there may have been, Misha knows this better, there may have been other pests that were targeted. We may get to a point where zebra mussels will require some sort of aquatic nuisance control. On the Quebec side of Memphremagog, they're already in that space on the water intake facilities on the north end of Lake Memphremagog. So we may get there, we're not there yet with zebra mussels.
This rule would be available then if other pests come along in addition to the sea lamprey.
All right, thanks for the clarity.
Oliver, I was going to say, there's a question up there on the, they said, please identify yourselves in the conference room when we're speaking.
Yeah, thanks, Brad.
People.
So that's, I see Mary, I have a hand up. I had a hand up from Mary. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, right. I was talking.
That was my comment for those remote, that it'd be nice for you all in the conference room to identify yourselves when you're talking, if that's acceptable to the process.
Definitely. Thanks for the
Yeah,
suggestion.
thanks.
Good
And-
point.
and- Again, that was Eric Rasmussen from Rutland Bass who was asking that question. Yeah.
Maybe we'll get to a point where we recognize each other's
Yeah,
voices.
we will.
So the screen in the room is stuck. I'm going to try to fix that, but I'm going to hand it over to Hannah just in the interest of time. I think Hannah, you're up next to give us a brief introduction to rulemaking.
Sure, yeah. And I'll try to be brief, just to give you an idea of the journey that we're on right now. So currently, all of our regulation over aquatic nuisance control is guided by statute. Specifically, it's Chapter 50 of Title 10. And as Pete mentioned, the statute's relatively, some aspects of the statute, some aspects of the definitions provided are vague. And the purpose of this rulemaking is to sort of clarify and codify the guidance that we use to implement the statutory requirements. We have explicit authority under statute to adopt rules in order to implement this chapter. And any rule adopted pursuant to Vermont's administrative procedures has the effect of a law, but it can be superseded by a statutory amendment. The purpose of the rulemaking is to clarify and codify scientifically justified guidelines and processes for implementing our statutory authority. The rules that we adopt through this process must be consistent with statute. We can, focus on certain elements of the statute that warrant clarification, but we don't have the ability in the rulemaking process to amend the authority that we're granted through statute. This process right now, the focus group that we're in is a voluntary focus group that is intended to maximize the public input and public engagement as we develop some of the rule language and to get feedback on the concepts that the program is intending to codify through this rule. Based on our tentative timeline, it looks like we'll go into the formal rulemaking process hopefully this summer. The rulemaking process itself, as Pete alluded to, is a much more rigidly structured process that doesn't allow for the kind of conversation that we're hoping to engage in at this point. So once we have a proposed draft rule, we'll submit it to the Interagency Committee on Administrative Rules. They review it for consistency with other administrative rules. The Secretary of State then implements a notice process that involves at least 30 days of notice, another opportunity to submit public comments. Presumably, there will be at least one other public meeting during that notice process. The agency is obligated to respond to all the comments that we receive, whether they're written or verbal. We provide a written response to those comments. And then the final proposed rule is reviewed by the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules, which looks to make sure that the rule is consistent with our statutory authority. Once that committee approves it, we would select an adoption date and the rule would go into effect. That's the it can take several months once you're actually in the formal rulemaking process. So I think in terms of expectations, it does, from the initiation of a focus group like this to actual adoption, can be 6 months to a year, depending on the complexity of the subject matter. Anything else I should add?
I think, well, let's see if anyone in the room or online has any questions for Hannah. Otherwise, we can move on to the next presentation from Misha Setner. But any questions on the general rulemaking process for Hannah? Hearing none, I'll hand it over to Misha. Misha, I think you start sharing your screen. Correct?
Yes, I will be. Yes.
Have the floor, and I want to see what happens when you hit share screen if it comes up.
All right, here goes nothing.
Okay.
Did it work?
Yep, we're good.
All right. Well, thanks for that introduction, Oliver, Pete, and Hannah. I'm hopeful that this could be wrapped up within a year. Again, as Hannah noted, it is a complicated subject. So I think, as Oliver noted, there's a lot of opinions on how this should proceed. So really, what I'm going to do here, present on, is just aquatic nuisance control permitting, the general points of the statute that we'd like to look into, what the permitting process looks like right now, as well as what is currently being permitted most frequently, and some of the approaches that DEC has used to improve the process through the means that we have without rules. So again, my name is Misha Setner. I've been the main point of contact doing the technical review for aquatic nuisance control permit applications for the past 7 years now. So I've seen a lot of change over this time, but it looks like there's more to come. So, and I apologize in advance. There's a lot of text in these slides because it kind of just goes right into the nitty gritty of what's in the statute. And so just jumping right into it, the statute defines what an aquatic nuisance is, and that's an undesirable or excessive substance or populations that interfere with recreational potential or aquatic habitat of a body of water, which includes rooted aquatic plants, animal, and algal populations. An interesting addition to that definition is that it calls out aquatic nuisances include zebra mussels, quagga mussels, Asian clam, the rest of these aquatic animal species. So that and it does end with or other species identified by rule. So it's an interesting definition that it might be worth looking into, better defining what this really means. Overall, aquatic nuisance control permitting, it's the statute is 10 VSA chapter 50, subsection 1455. And so what needs a permit? It's permits required for pesticides, chemicals other than pesticides, bottom barriers, structural controls, powered mechanical devices. All of those activities require an aquatic nuisance control permit for projects in waters of the state. So it is a very broad jurisdiction that covers a lot of water. So it's not just lakes and ponds, it's streams and rivers. So it gets lake management as well as the sea lamprey control projects that occur in the tributaries for Champlain. So in the statute, there's two sets of permitting standards. One's for pesticides, and the other set of standards are for all other control types. The standards for pesticides, though, are these 5 sets of criteria. No reasonable non-chemical alternative. There's an acceptable risk to non-target environment. There's a negligible risk to public health. A long-range management plan has been developed, which incorporates a schedule of pesticide minimization. And then finally, there's a public benefit to be achieved from the application of a pesticide, or if it's on a private property, no undue adverse effect upon the public good. For all the standards for the other project types really excludes, I mean, they're very similar language used, is just that it excludes conditions 1 and 4. So in the room, someone mentioned, does this, will this rulemaking process apply to non-chemical projects like bottom barriers or suction harvesting? Indirectly, yes, it will, because as we start to really get into the definitions here for defining, what do we mean by reasonable? What do we mean by acceptable risk? What is the non-target environment? Those standards are also used for those non-chemical controls. So the work that we do on that will spill over into those other projects.
And Misha, just to clarify, when we say pesticide there, pesticide, oh, never mind, that's this slide. So.
All right. Way ahead of you here. So the ANC statute has its own unique definition for pesticide, which is at the top of the screen here. Means any substance produced, distributed, or used for preventing, destroying, or repelling nuisance aquatic plants, insects, or other aquatic life, including lamprey. Pesticides include unicellular organisms or extracts from unicellular organisms and does not include biological controls. It's a pretty, it's an interesting definition, and it's very wide in its scope of what could be considered a pesticide. But then specifically, I do also want to note that the actual who regulates the specific use of pesticides, it's the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. That is a whole separate agency, and they regulate the registration process for pesticides that can be used in the state. So there is, kind of this, unique dynamic that we have between ANC permitting as well as what, how the Agency of Agriculture regulates the use of pesticides. So another part of the statute that's worth mentioning is that the Secretary can include additional conditions, requirements, and restrictions as deemed necessary to preserve and protect the quality of the receiving waters, protect the public health, and to minimize the impact to the non-target environment. Such conditions may include requirements concerning recording, reporting, and monitoring. Many of the permits that we issue for these types of projects have all sorts of monitoring and reporting requirements. That really helps to act as that feedback loop. Really, the permit identifies a structure for how a project can proceed, and so in the permit findings, we try to outline what the expectations of that project will be, and then these additional conditions, that's that feedback loop to us to allow us to kind of keep tabs on how a project is proceeding, and is it proceeding in accordance with our expectations? Is it not? If it's not, do we need to potentially reopen that permit and add additional conditions? So it's this is a part of statute that's been utilized quite a lot to really make sure that statute is being followed. Another thing to point out, under this statute, anyone can apply for an ANC permit. In general, for herbicide projects, the most common applicants are municipalities, lake associations, or a combination of the two. And in order to issue a permit, all statutory findings need to be made. So if during the review process, even if one of the 5 findings is not made, then it's a denial. So now I'm going to kind of jump over to just, what the application process is in a nutshell. Overall, these applications that they go through a application review process that is outlined under statute and different section of statute, but it's a standardized approach that DEC uses to notify applications on the environmental notice bulletin. It's a resource that the public can access. All application materials are posted. When a draft decision is made, that's put up on the environmental notice bulletin so that the public can review and comment on that decision. And specifically for aquatic nuisance control applications, they follow type 3 procedures. And so what does that mean? It's the last 3 bullet points as to what's required for type 3 procedures. So yeah, overall, it's spelled out as to how these applications move through the process. So once we get an application, all right, so there's that other process in the background that moves the application through, kind of like the public notice side of it. But what does it look like on the internal technical review side of it? So internally, once we get an application, the DECs use a very collaborative approach to review these applications to get input from other experts within the state to help review these 5 findings. A lot of these projects, they have overlap with other jurisdictions or other programs, divisions, departments within the state where the outcome of a decision, may interact with these other internal folks. And so we want to make sure that when we go through the review process, we're incorporating kind of like this level of internal review to make sure that a decision that is put out is consistent with other programs and departments within the state. And so, for example, when an application for a pesticide comes to us, that will set off this internal review process where Department of Health will be notified. Department of Forest Parks and Rec will be notified. Fish and Wildlife will be notified, and then other programs and divisions within DEC will be notified. And so right now we have a procedure that does specifically outline what this internal process looks like. This process was drafted in 2019, and we are so close to having it signed and finalized. So once that is signed and finalized, I will be very happy to share it with everyone. But it really does, it does outline this collaborative approach to reviewing how an application interacts with the statutory findings, and really trying to get that various technical input from other technical experts within the state. And then so what's been our programmatic approach to technical review? Overall, the goal of this program is to allow for aquatic nuisance control activities to occur, provided the adequate measures are taken to preserve and protect the quality of the receiving waters, to protect public health, and to minimize the impact on the non-target environment. In general, ANC permits, they're typically issued for the control of aquatic plants. Projects that target an aquatic invasive species are more likely to be permitted, as invasive species are considered one of the 10 major stressors on Vermont's surface waters. And so the primary species that is targeted for control is Eurasian water milfoil. It's an aquatic invasive species that's in a number of water bodies throughout the state. Another common species that major control projects happen on would be water chestnut. And for water chestnut, that's has been nothing but non-chemical control. But Eurasian water milfoil, it's a mix of chemical and non-chemical means has been used to control this invasive species. And in general, native aquatic vegetation is largely avoided. We typically minimize one of our goals is to minimize impacts on native aquatic vegetation. It's a part of the non-target environment that plays a very a vitally important process within the ecological integrity of water bodies. So that's why typically allowing for control projects to only target invasive species is an approach that we've taken. And overall, these control projects must balance the overall purpose of a project with ensuring that ecological integrity of the water body is maintained and risks to public health are negligible. We acknowledge and really try to get folks to understand that lakes and ponds, they are dynamic natural systems, and excessive aquatic plant removal really has the potential to negatively impact various aspects of that aquatic ecosystem. So it's we're really trying to incorporate in these decisions that while there may be a proposal to control an aquatic nuisance, there is inherently a lot of value with protecting the non-target environment, because it really helps to ensure that the ecological integrity of that water body is maintained. And so what does this all look like in terms of permits that are issued? The most common individual permit type that we issue is Eurasian water milfoil control projects, and that ranges from bottom barriers, diver-assisted suction harvesting, and herbicide. Currently, Procelicor is the herbicide that is applied for most frequently. Previously, that was the herbicides that were used were Sonar and Renovate. Procelicor, it's a relatively new herbicide, and it has generally been replaced applications for Sonar and Renovate for a number of reasons. But again, it's a DEC, we are not the applicants for these projects. We review applications and do not actually carry out these projects. The other common project type is just general aquatic nuisance plant control. Those are generally mechanical harvesting projects. A lot of those projects are located on Lake Champlain, where it's typically a large bay on Lake Champlain where there's a marina infrastructure or dense shoreline development where a mechanical harvesting machine is used to create navigation lanes out to open water. We also have an aquatic nuisance control general permit, and those are small approvals for bottom barriers or suction harvesting that's associated with a shoreline property. Generally, it's allowed to have a small area for someone's dock or swimming area adjacent to their shoreline property. And then the other common project type are sea lamprey control projects. We work with U.S. Fish and Wildlife on their applications, and anticipating several applications probably to be submitted to us shortly. So overall, DEC's made a concerted effort to improve the internal and public review of these ANC applications. As I noted earlier, we've got this aquatic nuisance control internal review procedure. It is, again, fingers crossed. We really hope this gets signed soon, just because it is a really important piece of the review process that I think would be really helpful, that for the public to see that yes, it's it's a whole slew of other folks that review and work with DEC on reviewing these applications. Additionally, that law I referred to earlier that guides the overall application process, the environmental notice bulletin. As a part of that law, there's an adjoining property owner notification, so that we've used that law to require that all adjoining property owners be notified of an ANC application. So what that looks like when, let's say, a lake association is applying to use an herbicide to take on a Eurasian water milfoil management project, the expectation would be that they need to certify that they've notified all shoreline property owners that they're applying for this project, and all property owners living up to 1 mile downstream. Another aspect that we've really made a concerted effort on is to just increasingly standardize decisions and permit conditions. Overall, this helps to really set expectations for the public on what they could reasonably apply for, as well as what to expect if a permit is issued. A lot of this standardization has come about through discussions with internal experts within the state to really bring any concerns that they may have really front and center and fold those concerns into the findings of a permit and just the overall decision-making process. So that July 1st start date for non-chemical control projects, that's now the going standard. We use that to be protective of the spring spawning period. For herbicide projects used to manage Eurasian water milfoil in a water body, we've landed on a littoral zone maximum percentage for control projects, which we've landed on the percentage of 40%. So control projects cumulatively, so that's herbicide or non-chemical controls, can't exceed 40% of the littoral zone over 1 calendar year. This was a concern that we worked with the Department of Fish and Wildlife on, and that was to get at being protective of just the physical habitat that's provided by aquatic plants. Another aspect that we've really brought into it is better identification of wetlands within water bodies and how these projects interact with the wetland rules. And then another aspect is where pesticide minimization annual reporting. This is a fairly new permit condition that's come about in the past couple of years. And this was actually in relation to reacting to public comments from previous permit decisions, where now if a permittee actually does act on their permit to use an herbicide, that then triggers the need for them to actively implement pesticide minimization measures and then report to us that they're actively working on pesticide minimization measures. That's a part of their long-term management plan. So I included this graph just as something interesting to look at. This is mapping the acres treated per year to control Eurasian water milfoil starting in the year 2000. Yeah, just something to take a look at. Not really trying to prove any major point. Just generally this is all the herbicide use that has been approved for use in Vermont since the year 2000. And this is thought it'd be worth including this as well. I got some of this data from New Hampshire just to show that this is focusing in on the last couple of years here, especially with with Percelicor now being on the market. Want to show that this is not an issue that is just only in Vermont. The use of Percelicor and aquatic herbicides, it's a common project type throughout the country, and just the use of aquatic herbicides does vary pretty greatly between where you are located in this country. But overall, so I got this data from counterparts over in New Hampshire. I also work frequently with folks over in New York, Maine, Massachusetts, Midwestern states. We're in frequent communications, and then we've got regional meetings that discuss these topics. And so there's a lot of eyes, a lot of experts that are constantly looking at and reviewing these products. And then we discuss with one another, hey, is this how is this working in your state? Is it meeting your expectations? Have you seen any red flags? So it's we're in frequent communication with with other states to just get that overall regional perspective. So that's kind of ANC permitting in a nutshell. It's a lot there.
Yeah,
But
thanks,
now-
Misha. Let's stop there and take see if there's any questions before we go on to the next section.
Sounds
I saw
good.
there was one hand that may have gone down, but Mary, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just curious in that last slide what the acronym, I think it was VLM stands for. That seemed to be the big difference between the two states. Thank you.
So yeah, VLM, that's variable leaved water milfoil. It's another aquatic invasive species. Variable leaf water milfoil is more commonly found in New Hampshire. We do have it in Vermont, and just fingers crossed, it's still only in Lake Champlain, I think. But yeah, so over here in Vermont, Eurasian water milfoil, that's the dominant species that is the aquatic invasive species that is managed here. But variable leaf water milfoil is most commonly managed in New Hampshire.
Yeah, and so Mary, that could be part of the difference. New Hampshire has a larger number of acres of lakes than Vermont does as well. So that could be part of the difference we're seeing in the two states, as well as different permitting regimes in the two states and statutory requirements. Any other questions for Misha on the aquatic nuisance control statute and permitting process?
I just, for clarification, Misha was referring to it when a decision is made.
Who are you?
I'm sorry, I'm Eric Palmer. I'm Fish Division Director for Vermont Fish and Wildlife. And Misha, when you talk about a decision being made on an aquatic nuisance control permit, who within the agency is the decision-making authority?
Yeah, so DEC is the decision-making authority, and that does land with the Lakes and Ponds program. And so as you know, Eric, we to get to that final decision, we do work internally within the state to make sure that we incorporate that internal concerns into that final decision. But yes, ultimately the Lakes and Ponds program makes that final decision.
Great, I don't see any other hands. So Misha, thanks for that clear presentation. Obviously, 10 VSA 1455 is available online and on the Vermont DEC Lakes and Ponds website. We have an aquatic nuisance control permitting page, which provides some text, more background on this. And then there's a document we came up with earlier sometime last year, actually, specifically on permitting herbicide projects in Vermont. It's about a 15-page document with some facts and some answers to frequently asked questions. If folks haven't seen that, it's a good primer for some of the information we're covering in this focus group as well. So I think we'll move on to the next part, is to go over the rulemaking themes, the pieces that we want to cover with this focus group over the coming weeks and months. So Misha, back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. I think the timeline for this group is to work through these three themes over the next half year. And so the first theme that we'll be tackling is to develop definitions for terms used in the statutory findings, such as like acceptable, reasonable, negligible, as well as refine the definitions in the statute. The second theme is develop public determination review criteria. And the third, better define permit application requirements and the agency jurisdiction. So again, like that first theme that we'll be diving into, try to use the goal would be to use rulemaking to set qualitative and quantitative definitions. Because when trying to review an application, with the criteria being reasonable, acceptable risk, what do those words specifically mean? What is the non-target environment? A negligible risk, what does that mean? Public health, what do we consider public health? Those are big picture questions as to how an application is reviewed. And in recent years, with the public participating with the decision-making process, I've received many comments as well. Did you look at this? Did you look at that? How is this considered? Is this a non-target environment? And so, because there's no additional definition, it makes decision-making fairly challenging. As I noted, we've made a standardization effort to clarify what some of this means. So in permit decisions now, I define what I consider the non-target environment for a project. So that's clear to the public that that's when this finding was reviewed, this is what was considered.
So, Misha,
That's the second theme. Oh, go ahead.
Can you just go back there for a second?
Yep.
So, just this, there's no reasonable non-chemical alternative available. One question that comes to mind is when an herbicide project is proposed, someone in the public might say, well, why can't they just use diver-assisted suction harvesting or bottom barriers for that issue? And there's lots of ways to respond to that question. But one of the things to think about in terms of reasonable is, does cost enter the definition of reasonable? If it's going to cost $20 million to put bottom barriers at the number of acres where the applicant is proposing to use chemicals, is that reasonable? Should cost be part of a reasonable definition? Is effectiveness, part of a reasonable definition? Those are the kind of things we want people's input on to help us come up with that definition. I know we can look in the dictionary and see it, and I think Misha's permit findings provide some basis for this discussion, but we'd like to ask you to think about, how we can apply that term reasonable in response to that permit finding.
Yeah, and I think it also, in terms of what's reasonable, it also boils down to what's the scope of the project. Are you targeting an aquatic invasive species? Well, then, maybe, that, using an herbicide may be a reasonable approach. In general, while other states may allow for folks to target native aquatic vegetation with herbicides, we've taken a pretty hard stance against that. Where if, to my knowledge, in any recent history, we have not approved any project proposing to control a native species with an herbicide. As there likely are reasonable non-chemical alternatives to that, and we also want to minimize impact on those native aquatic species. So yeah, reasonable. I think that it's a challenging word to really try to work with this this finding.
A question?
Yeah.
Brad Young, Fish and Wildlife Service. Maybe a Hannah question, perhaps for a statutory type thing. Are the words such as reasonable and acceptable, are those common statutory language that are purposefully kept vague so that policymakers can make those judgments? Or is it something that's just maybe in need of updating, an archaic language that is in our interest to make more objective rather than subjective?
I think that they're intentionally used because in every program, there is intended to be a level of interpretation that the staff that are actually implementing the permitting program, undertakes. So not archaic, but in other rules, we've elaborated on what criteria we look at in terms of defining what's reasonable.
Okay.
So that's something that has been addressed through the rulemaking process, particularly that word reasonable. Reasonable and practicable are the two that just come up over and over. Intentionally used in statute and then argued about in perpetuity.
Okay, thank you.
And just one follow-up question for Hannah. This, I forget what year the statute was passed, but I think it's at least 10 years old. Is it uncommon that a statute that contemplated rulemaking in statutory language goes for 10 years without rulemaking taking place, or is it really depends on situation?
I think it depends on the situation. There is rulemaking authority throughout this Vermont statutes that have never been seized and exercised. Yeah. So it does depend on the program.
Thanks.
All right, any other questions on theme 1? Moving on to theme 2. The public good determination. So for a project proposing a pesticide in public waters, there needs to be a public benefit. So currently in this statute, there is no guidance as to what a public good determination looks like. So, the question is, how does DEC approach this? So again, going back to this the standardization effort that we've really embraced over the past number of years here, we have a. I work with the rest of the regulatory groups within the Lakes program, which includes lake encroachment permitting. Lake encroachment permitting is for any encroachment into public waters in the state, and that also requires a public good determination. And in that statute, it does identify criteria that's considered for a public good determination. And that permitting program also established a procedure that identifies how to make a public good determination back in 1989. We still use that procedure to make lake encroachment decisions, to do that public good determination. And so part of the standardization effort that we've used for aquatic nuisance control is to really try to mimic the public good determination that's made with lake encroachment applications, but add an aquatic nuisance control more centric wording to that determination. So yeah, it's what is the public benefit? How is that defined? How is it measured? It's a complicated question. And then how should that interact with opposition to a project? Is a project in the public good if there's a significant public pushback? How is that measured? It's a challenging subject to try to address, and how do you identify criteria that you could use in a public good determination to say yes, the public, there may be certain groups or the public municipalities opposed to a project, and this is how it's weighed in that public good determination. Any questions on that?
Yeah, I have a question. Just it's maybe semantics, but public benefit. Is there anything does that? Why wouldn't you say public benefit and state? There seems to be you'd want to do this because there's a benefit to the state. I'm sorry, is that a distinction there? Because the public to me seems like citizens of the world, right? But it seems which would distinguish the difference between public and a benefit to the state.
Yeah.
Okay.
There are, it's referenced in the guidance that Misha referenced, the analysis for determining public good in lake encroachment. It talks about the greatest benefit to the greatest number of Vermonters.
Okay.
So as part of the rulemaking, Hannah, we could make that clarification. We could define how we're considering the word public.
Yeah, we'd want to be consistent with the way we've done it in other rules that the agency implements, but yes.
Yeah.
I'll put that, I just found the link to that document that Misha was referring to. I'll put it in the chat and also send it around after the meeting.
All right, any other questions on public good?
Just a comment again, Eric Palmer, Fish and Wildlife. I know that there's been some attention paid to the idea that one individual can apply for a permit.
Mhm.
And the, you know, some concern around why is that allowed? And I think looking at this public benefit question might address that, yeah, one individual, any individual can apply for a permit, but whether they receive a permit or not depends in part as to whether there's a larger public benefit.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great angle to look at this. Because it's a challenging aspect, because really at this point anyone could apply for really anything. But how should that be weaved into a public good determination?
And so, Misha, you mentioned the standardization and using the lake encroachment interim public good determination procedures, applying those to your work against this finding for aquatic nuisance control permits. And to give people an idea of how you've applied those criteria, we could also perhaps share, we could find a permit that you've issued for herbicide control, and where you've basically put forth your finding, you're writing your rationale, your decision against this finding. That might be something that would be useful to share with this group as well.
Yeah. So I think the most recent permit for herbicide was for Procelicor at Lake Fairley. I think that was issued about a year ago. And yeah, so how a permit is structured, it starts off with the specific conditions that identify what specifically we need a permittee to do, and then there's standard conditions that's kind of has a lot of just very broad conditions, some legal conditions in there, and then the third section of a permit is the findings of a permit, and so that discussion in the findings specifically goes into how those statutory criteria were reviewed. And I largely I've really tried to standardize that after a fairly major decision on an herbicide project in 2018, which was a denial for an herbicide project. That denial in 2018 was a result of many public comments on a draft permit that had, the public comments were very technical in nature, and they really asked a lot of really good technical questions that undermined what that draft permit decision was. And so eventually, in actually responding to all of those public comments, it went from a draft permit to a denial. And so that process of going through that process really gave us the ability to hone in on concerns from the public, and really bake it into the findings and how these applications are reviewed and then conditioned. And then finally, the third theme, permit application requirements in ANC jurisdiction. So this one, it's really to help better define just what is required to apply, particularly for a chemical treatment. So here we've got criteria number 4, a long-range management plan, which incorporates a schedule of pesticide minimization. Well, what needs to be provided? What are the expectations, the requirements around what should a long-range management plan look like, and what should pesticide minimization be? These are pretty big questions that having a rule around that would really help clarify what the expectations are for the public and how they apply for these projects, and then give us at DEC an ability to review an application versus some more specific criteria as to what this all means. And in addition to the application requirements, just better clarification around ANC jurisdiction, and identify potential permit exclusions such as private ponds constructed for snowmaking, golf course irrigation, stormwater management, fire suppression. So where exactly does, really honing in on where this jurisdiction applies. And then so finally, in conclusion here, aquatic nuisance, again, defined in statute as interfering with the recreational potential or aquatic habitat of a water body. And through this rulemaking process, we should improve how an applicant can clearly demonstrate that aquatic nuisances are indeed interfering with habitat or recreational potential, as well as what metrics or qualitative criteria can be applied to assess whether the 5 permitting standards for herbicide are met. And overall, I really appreciate everyone taking the time to work on this, to voluntarily joining this this focus group. It's a complicated topic with a lot of complicated opinions and technical information to chew through. So I really appreciate it. Again, I've been living and breathing this for the past 7 years now, so it's I think it's great to see this level of interest. I really look forward to working with you all on addressing some of these big picture questions.
Great. Thanks, Misha. Does anyone have any questions for Misha on the 3 rulemaking themes?
Yeah, this is Eric from Rutland Bass. I understand what you're trying to do here, and I'm wondering, for me, some upfront context might be helpful. So my first question is, I know we're trying to do rulemaking for herbicides, but what is the role of the state in terms of just generally managing a pond or a lake, right? Are you actively going and looking? I mean, it seems like the state would be identifying issues before the public, right? And then, kind of why I'm here is to learn about this and help, but it seems odd that that a person or an organization sees a perceived problem, right? And then provides a solution for that problem, right? That's hard to it seems like there should be something up front, right? And so you're not debating the permit or the solution, right? But that, we all have expertise. You have expertise. This is kind of the approach that we as the state should be taking. So if I understand that context, and I maybe for others, it might help to understand that to then help make the rules about applying for permits. And that might be a longer discussion, and I'm happy for that if it's offline or at the next meeting. But I think that would be helpful to me.
Yeah, I'll try to answer the first part of your question quickly, just in the interest of time. So the state, acting through the Agency of Natural Resources, DEC, Watershed Management Division, has management objectives, management goals for quote unquote waters of the state for the 805 or so lakes and ponds in Vermont. Those, and those are best articulated in our surface water management strategy, which is a statewide document, as well as the strategic plan for the lakes and ponds program within DEC. Those goals and all the objectives come up against the reality of having limited staff and limited resources.
Mm-hmm.
And so we focus our efforts in certain areas. So when you look at aquatic nuisance control, what is the role of the state versus what is the role of residents,
Mm-hmm.
lake associations, municipalities? Our role is one of regulation. Our role is one of sort of establishing policy, and of course the legislature does that too.
Right,
So
right.
we play our respective role: administration, legislature, and in some cases we are doing direct hands-on management of aquatic invasive species. Think about things like early detection and rapid response, supporting breeder programs that prevent the spread of invasive species. When it comes specifically to aquatic nuisance control, because of the statutory environment we're working in, because of the realities of the number of staff and financial resources we have, you could look at the situation and say, to some extent, the state does regulation, permitting, authorization, but we've sort of outsourced some of the actual day-to-day management of these water bodies to interested organizations and individuals across the state, typically lake associations and municipalities, as Misha articulated. 30 years ago, we had more staff going out and pulling weeds out of from lakes that were just getting infested with Eurasian water milfoil, who worked for the DEC. We don't do very much of that today just because we don't have the staffing resources, and the way that the legislature has oriented us is more on the regulatory side. So I think it's a sort of it's a situation where we're using the authorities that have been granted to us and working in very close partnership with lake associations, municipalities, and other interested groups to achieve our shared objectives. When the objective of a partner conflicts with what our role is, that's where our sort of heavy regulatory hand comes in. As Misha mentioned, there's an example, not too many of these, but we deny the occasional herbicide permit because it conflicts with the statutory findings. So in many ways, we're implementing these statutory findings, but it's up to the Lake Eden Protective Association to say, we see this problem, we understand what the options are based on interaction with the state, the outreach and the technical assistance that we provide, but then doing the actual implementation of projects is left to, in most cases, to the lake associations and the municipalities to actually do. We're able to provide some financial support to that through the Aquatic Nuisance Control Grant Program, which typically funds about 25% of the costs of over 40 annual projects. The rest of the funds comes from municipalities and lake associations. So even there, we don't have the resources to play as large a role.
So basically, the public, the lake associations, the municipalities are the stewards of the lakes, right? And they're advising you that there's an issue. And then I guess during the permitting process, they provided a solution, right? Currently, I think if I read it correctly, right, you're going to go through a whole bunch of departments to review that, right? And the outcome.
They propose a project based on the statutory and guidelines, rules that is allowable. So, they're not going to propose a solution that we're going to instantly reject. We hope they're not going to do something that is illegal, but they propose a project and then we adjudicate in an application. They propose a project, we adjudicate that application, and if they meet these statutory findings, we authorize them to implement the project. I think that your choice of word of stewards is good. It's accurate. We love to think of ourselves in the state as stewards as well, but there's 805 lakes and 10 of us.
Right, yeah.
So we rely on these partners to be sort of the on the ground stewards.
Now, with all the options that are available, right? Does the state have any guidelines that say, hey, harvesting is good here, and dash is good here, and dredging is good here, and that is that available? For people to see? And
yeah, Misha, you want to talk about that briefly?
Yeah, in the permit decisions, we do try to outline where projects should be focused. We're not the ones doing the projects. So, in these permits, we try to create a framework to say, when a permittee is gearing up to do a project, here's how you should be approaching it. And so when they come to us to say, hey, we've read the findings of the permit and we're working with you on how to address control projects for this year, we'll work with them on identifying where a certain project type might be more appropriate and why. But again, we're not the ones doing the project, so I don't fully have control over where someone may, if they have a permit to use herbicides, suction harvesting, bottom barriers, what have you. They're there to follow their permits, and if they have their own ideas to how they'd like to control Eurasian water milfoil in a specific area, they can apply to, they have the permit, and then they need additional approval annually. And so through that process, we refine kind of like annual control areas. So unfortunately, that's
We
not
don't
a,
have
a super straightforward answer, but it's nuanced how these control areas are applied for and then approved.
Thank you. I mean, that helps with some of my understanding things.
We can have discussions about that offline. I would just say, we don't have today a statewide aquatic invasive species sort of specific management plan. The Lake Champlain Basin program developed a nice one for the Lake Champlain Basin. Meg Moodley knows that very well. She's on the call. That's only a subset of the state. We've identified developing the Vermont aquatic invasive species prevention and management plan, which is only a piece of aquatic nuisance control that affects that. That's something that we're trying to put out, which would sort of say what our desired end state is for the waters, and then how we can try to get there, the management options we have and the resources that we have. I was looking at the times 4:23. There's one more piece of the presentation I want to get to, but any other questions for Misha on what he just presented? All right, I'm going to try to share my screen just to wrap up the sort of the presenting part of this meeting today. So I can go backwards. Should get us there. Okay. So I'm going to manage scheduling the meetings. I'll continue to use polls with 2-3 options. Choose the time that works best for people. We'll try to stick to the timeline that was in the original email I sent to you. It's on a couple slides away. At the end of each meeting, we'll try to outline expectations and topics for the next meeting. Give participants time to come prepared. We'll probably identify some preparatory documents we'd like to send out, and allow folks to prepare. We have an aquatic nuisance control website. I think in the interest of transparency and sharing information about what we're doing with this rulemaking effort, we'd like to sort of put some of the information that we've shared with you about the goals of this group up on that website so the public can see what we're doing. I also plan to publish sanitized minutes. Really, and I'd like to get voluntary agreement from the group if folks are amenable of using this Chatham House rule. What this is doing is trying to strike the balance between, we don't want to be seen as secretive, hiding things, or running some secret process that's behind closed doors. But we also want folks to be able to speak freely, speak their mind, and not worry that, you know, Joe said this, and then what Joe said is going to be on social media by someone else in the group posted right after the meeting. So this Chatham House rule, something I've used in previous work, it's basically is when a meeting is held under this Chatham House rule, participants are free to use the information received so that you could talk about it, you could post on social media about it after the meeting, but don't identify the affiliation of the speakers nor that of the participants, the names of the participants. So you'd be able to say, we discussed this, there was debate on these topics, here are some of the different arguments that were put forth, but without saying, you know, Oliver from DC was going on and on about something, whatever idiot he is. You know, I think that's a bunch of BS. So that's trying to find the right balance between sharing information, not being secretive, but allowing folks to speak freely and not having folks worry that what I say is going to be used against me or taken out of context. So you can Google Chatham House rule if you're interested and read more about how it came to be. But this to me is the approach we'll take with our so-called sanitized minutes. And I'd like to ask if folks in the group would agree if they do want to report back to their organizations about what we've discussed, which is fine, to do it in this way. So I'll ask if people are okay with that approach. And so, for example, on our website, what I would do is say, here are the organizations represented in the focus group. I wouldn't name names. I would say there's a representative from Fish and Wildlife Non-Game, representative from Bass Club, so the public can see, oh, great, they have this cross section of organizations, or geez, why don't they have this other organization there? And then they could ask us, but without naming names and so forth. So does that sound okay to people? Please, I'll take silence as consent on that one.
Try.
So I'll be the primary point of contact. And as we move forward in this to generate discussions and to maximize productive meeting time, DEC and any volunteers from the group that want to be more involved can put together straw proposals, drafts, concept language, and share that with participants prior to the meeting so we can comment on stuff ahead of time, get right down to discussing ideas, potential language, et cetera. So we may come up with a straw proposal prior to a meeting, share it around, folks can comment on it, respond to me, et cetera. And what we're really looking for is comments and inputs to help inform how we draft the rule. What are the concepts and the ideas you have for these 3 rulemaking themes? We're probably not going to ask the entire group to be helping us wordsmith a rule. I think when we get to actually drafting the rule, we'll get sort of the best experts who are attorneys and subject matter experts to draft the rule. I don't think we want to be wordsmithing stuff with a group of 24 people. When we do have draft language, folks can certainly provide input on it and respond to it and comment on it when we get to that point. And then finally, as Pete mentioned and Misha mentioned, in terms of the authorities, you know, we'll try to get as close to the consensus as we can. We may not get to a point where everyone agrees with all of what we've written or even a lot of what we've written. We will eventually take all the input, incorporate it to the best of our ability, and then make it call as DEC, and then engage in formal rulemaking. But we really hope, we respect everyone's input. That's why we've asked you to be here. We want to do our best to accommodate it. So here's the timeline again. I think that's basically what I have in terms of any other information to share with you. So this is our January meeting. We've so far we're in our second month and we're still on time. Our January
Wrong
meeting.
year, but
Say it again.
wrong year.
Wrong year. Thank you. I was making sure that people were awake. No, that was my mistake. Thanks for the correction. January 23, we had today's meeting, background, rationale, and approach, et cetera. February and March, we want to get into the acceptable, reasonable, and negligible term definition that are codified, the justifications required before chemicals are used. See how that goes. April will focus on public good determination, and May will focus on permit application requirements and exclusions. We'll conclude the stakeholder group hopefully in June, and we'll begin drafting a draft rule at some point. But we'll seek the group's input on that draft. And eventually it goes to our political leadership in DC and agency of natural resources for their consideration. And we hope to begin formal rulemaking process that Hannah mentioned in July, and we gave that 6 months. You know, this is a rough draft. When we complete these steps, we might refer back to this and then we can laugh. We thought we could do this in 6 months. It took us 9 or whatever the case may be. That's what we're shooting for. And so I think I would be remiss not to comment that if we have an application in today, we will likely, following our statutory timelines, to review an existing application that will likely be complete before this rulemaking process is complete. So I know that there's interest in the Lake Bombazine Association's herbicide application for Lake Bombazine among certain group members. We will have to review that application and likely make a determination prior to December of 2023, which is our best guess for when this formal rulemaking process will be complete. So I think the best way to look at this is more forward-looking as opposed to influencing an existing application that's already with DEC. It's 4:30. Yeah, so I wanted to leave you with that's our next goal. As I said before, thanks for your contributions. And we have the room, so if folks want to stay and ask questions or seek clarification, any points, I know a number of us can stay after 4:30. You need to move on to your next commitment. That's fine too. So Pete, anything you want to say to close out?
No, thanks, Oliver. I thought that was a really good review. So are we going to commit then before the February meeting to push out a straw proposal perhaps on those definitional terms?
I think that's a great idea. I think we can work with Hannah to see how other rulemaking efforts have defined reasonable, maybe the practicable one just for reference.
Yep.
And then throw out some options or some ideas, maybe include some permit findings that Misha's used.
Just to give us a basis for focusing our discussion next time.
Yeah, I think there will clearly we at DC will have some work to prepare for that meeting.
Yep.
We'll try to give everyone 2 weeks notice and push out some draft material to folks can come prepared, ready to discuss something. So this was a lot of talking at you today. I apologize for that. We wanted to make sure everyone's sort of on the same page, and we hope to have more participation from the group at future meetings. And finally, is everyone okay with not recording future sessions? I will stop recording this. I'll send the recording to our 2 members who weren't present today. But I think we will take minutes at future meetings. But I think the benefit of having an unrecorded session outweighs the benefits of having a recording.
I'm okay with that. I like the idea that you're sending out minutes afterwards, right?
Yep. Great, so I'm gonna stop recording, but we're still here. Please, if you have any questions or any comments, feel free to ask them. And if you want to hit the road, that's fine too. Now we've entered the informal part of the process with the 90-minute formal meeting period.